In Pennsylvania, the night manager of a fast food restaurant is found brutally murdered, the apparent victim of a robbery gone bad. For 15 years, police are unable to identify a suspect. But then, an elite group of forensic experts agree to take on the case. A man disappears from his Lubbock, Texas home. All indications point to foul play. But until police can find the victim's body, they are powerless to prove murder. When the trail of clues stops, homicide investigators are often left with few options. But an elite group of forensic experts, known as the Vidocq Society, can heat up a cold case and apply their expertise to deliver collective justice. On February 4th, 1984, in the Philadelphia suburb of Falls Township, Pennsylvania, the manager of a fast food restaurant arrived for the early morning shift. He was alarmed to find that the front door was unlocked. Recently, there had been a string of robberies in the area. Nothing appeared to be missing. But in the kitchen, he discovered the night manager, Terry Brooks, lying on the floor. She had been brutally murdered. Within minutes, officers and forensic technicians from the Falls Township Police Department arrived at the scene. They found the 25-year-old victim lying face up on the kitchen floor. A large knife jutted out of her throat. A plastic trash bag had been used to cover her face. Judging by the coat she was wearing, it appeared Terry Brooks was preparing to leave for the evening. In the restaurant office, police found that the cash drawers and money bags had been cleaned out. The victim's shoes were found lying by the desk. Though this was just one of several restaurants to be robbed within a few months, it was the first to end in murder. Technicians searched for any clues to the killer's identity. They found nothing. No signs of a forced entry were found around the unlocked front door. Based on the evidence, police theorized that after Terry Brooks left the restaurant, she was ambushed by the robber and then forced back inside. Her death had been a violent one. Terry Brooks had been beaten, strangled, and then stabbed in the throat. She had been dead several hours. Hair and skin scrapings were found in the victim's hands and fingernails, indicating she had put up a fierce struggle. But in the days before DNA testing was available, examiners could only conclude that the samples had not come from the victim. Looking for any clue to help them identify a suspect, investigators interviewed the victim's parents. Terry, they said, was a cheerful young woman who made friends easily. She had put herself through college and worked hard, hoping to own her own restaurant one day. Recently, she had quit her job as a waitress for a better opportunity as the manager of the fast food restaurant.
Hey, babe. What brings you here?
She had just gotten engaged to a co-worker from her previous place of employment. Though Terry was living at home, her parents didn't know her fiancé very well. The engagement had been sudden. They couldn't think of anyone who might want to hurt their daughter. Terry's fiancé, 22-year-old Scott Keefe, also had no idea who could have committed such a brutal act. On the night of the murder, he was home sleeping. He had to be up early the next day. Around 6 a.m. the following morning, he drove by her house on his way to work. He knew Terry had worked late, and he wanted to be certain she had arrived home safely. When he noticed her car wasn't in the driveway, he became concerned and woke up her parents.
Hey, Mr. Brooks. How's it going?
What are you doing here, honey?
When they discovered Terry had not been home, they called the restaurant. That's when they learned she had been murdered. Though robbery appeared to be the motive behind the murder, police returned to the restaurant to speak with the manager. They collected all of the employee files, looking for evidence that the killer may have been a disgruntled employee. The manager could think of no one on his staff that had a problem with him or Terry. Everything suggested that Terry Brooks had been a random target. And for police, those are the toughest cases to solve. Desperate to generate a lead, examiners scrutinized all of the evidence collected from the crime scene. They were in luck. A single latent fingerprint was found on the trash bag that covered the victim's face. It was matched to one of Terry Brooks's co-workers at the restaurant.
Ma'am,
Detectives brought in the employee for questioning and to give blood and hair samples.
explain why it was there.
But she didn't seem capable of the violence inflicted on Terry Brooks. And the employee had an explanation for the print. Before leaving on the night of the murder, she had replaced all of the trash can liners. She said that she hadn't noticed anything unusual that night.
We were told that you were supposed to...
However, she did recall an incident a few days earlier. Near closing time, two men came into the restaurant. They appeared drunk and were causing trouble.
Yeah, let me get a cheeseburger.
The employee called her manager. Terry tried unsuccessfully to defuse the situation. When she threatened to call the police, the men became verbally abusive. They made several threats before leaving. The employee didn't know the men and hadn't seen them since that night. Police finally had their first big break in the case. Now they needed to identify the killers before they struck again. Several area store owners had similar encounters with individuals who fit the description of the two men. But no one seemed to know who they were or where they could be found. The identity of the prime suspects in Terry's murder continued to elude police. Soon, the investigation into her murder turned cold. And it would remain that way for the next 14 years. After 14 years, it seemed that the 1984 murder of 25-year-old restaurant manager Terry Brooks would never be solved. But in 1998, police in Falls Township, Pennsylvania, decided to re-examine all of the unsolved homicides in their jurisdiction. Detective Sergeant Wynn Cloud came across the Terry Brooks case file.
There was a lot of physical evidence available, and I examined all that, and it was all good physical evidence and preserved well. I believe that this had a very high solvability.
Sergeant Cloud enlisted the aid of Homicide Detective Nelson Whitney and Deputy District Attorney Lori Markle. After reviewing the case files, the team found a hole in the investigation conducted more than a decade earlier.
At that time, there were several fast food restaurant robberies that were occurring in this area, and the investigation conducted in the 80s had really focused on that idea. So we decided that in addition to looking at the possibility that the murder was a robbery homicide, we would also learn more about Terry and investigate the possibility that the murderer had been someone who knew her.
Investigators tracked down the people who knew Terry and her habits well. They located her former manager. When he viewed the crime scene photos for the first time, one in particular caught his attention. Detective Nelson Whitney explains.
So one of the things that Terry would do every day would be to clean out the ashes out of the ashtray and place it in a little ledge above the desk. She would close the ledger on the desk. She would put the phone in a certain position, put the ruler and the calculator away. The photograph of the desk from the crime scene clearly showed that the ashtray was in the middle of the desk, that it had ashes in it. There was an open book there, a ruler was out, a calculator was out.
Terry was also known to kick off her shoes when she did desk work. The information was at odds with previous suspicions that Terry was accosted outside the restaurant and then forced back inside. And that opened up the possibility that she knew her killer and had even let him inside the store.
She opens the safe at some point whether she was...
But so far, that was only a theory, and one that put investigators no closer to identifying Terry Brooks's killer. Police needed more help. For that, they turned to an elite crime-solving team headquartered just a few miles away in Philadelphia. There, in the historic Downtown Club building, some of the greatest criminal theorists had been meeting every other month since 1990. This is the home of the Vidocq Society, a non-profit private brain trust of the nation's most esteemed law enforcement officials, forensics experts, psychologists, and government agents. Dick Laventhal is the Director of Communications for the Vidocq Society.
The society is named after Eugene Francois Vidocq, Frenchman that lived from 1775 to 1852. We credit him with being the father of modern-day detective practice. He's truly our inspiration. He's a man that thought out of the box. He was the first detective who began to keep files and records on criminals' methods of operations.
The society is limited to 82 full-time members, one for each year of Vidocq's life. Originally, they assembled to discuss historical cases and mysterious unsolved crimes. That soon changed.
Very quickly, we segued into an organization whose reason for existence was to look into unsolved homicides and try to solve the anguish of families when there's a loved one who's been murdered.
To have an unsolved homicide accepted by the Vidocq Society, investigators must first present their case to its members. At the next Vidocq gathering, Sergeant Cloud did just that.
I presented this on a factual nature. I did not give any theories, so I wouldn't taint any of their opinions. Everything I gave them were what facts I gathered from the case, from the crime scene. And after I was done presenting to them, I was approached by probably 30 members, possibly even more, but 30 that were real interested in it.
Vidocq Society co-founder Richard Walter offered to donate his expertise to the case.
My area is crime assessment and profiling. And basically, crime assessment is the act of looking at the crime scene, what's there as well as what's not there at that crime scene. Then taking that information and reconciling that with known patterns of behavior that we know in terms of criminal activity. So we know a great deal about the offender from the crime scene.
For Walter, the violence observed in photographs suggested the killer was motivated by vengeance or anger, not money. Walter believed that the killer was someone close to the victim, and the robbery was staged to throw investigators off his trail. From the lack of organization observed at the crime scene, Detective Cloud also learned that the killer likely had little more than a high school education. He probably worked as a menial laborer, perhaps a cook at a pizza or hamburger joint. Because of his rage, experts theorized he likely had difficulty maintaining relationships with women. Investigators turned to the victim's parents, hopeful they could identify someone who resembled the profile. Terry's father was dying of liver disease. The couple didn't know anyone who resembled the profile. However, they recalled that on the morning of the murder, Terry's fiancé, Scott Keefe, had acted strangely. Though Keefe appeared upset to learn his fiancée had been murdered, he refused to go to the hospital to help identify the victim. He said he didn't want to be late for work. For Terry's parents, Scott's actions that morning had always led them to believe he was hiding something. Police agreed. To find out what that was, investigators interviewed Terry's old friends. None spoke highly of Scott. They were all surprised to learn Terry was engaged to him. Scott was possessive and jealous, and he was in financial trouble that allegedly resulted from a drug problem. Things became more strained when Terry took a pay cut to manage the fast food restaurant. Just before she was murdered, Terry had talked about ending the engagement. Based on the information, Detective Cloud began delving into Scott Keefe's background. What he found was an uncanny parallel to the psychological portrait generated by Vidocq Society experts, right down to his job.
Our ultimate suspect worked at a pizza joint, had been for years. He had several relationships, personal relationships, but they were very rocky.
With the help of the Vidocq Society, investigators had finally identified a suspect in the 15-year-old slaying of Terry Brooks. Now it was up to Falls Township Police to prove it. With the help of the Vidocq Society, an elite non-profit group of law enforcement officials, police in Falls Township, Pennsylvania had finally identified a suspect in the 1984 murder of Terry Brooks. Now, investigators turned to physical evidence collected nearly 15 years earlier to prove it. The biological evidence collected at the time of the autopsy was forwarded to the nearby drug scan laboratory. There, new DNA technology, unheard of at the time of the murder, had become a sophisticated crime-solving tool. Forensic scientist Diane Marshall examined the evidence. The samples had been carefully stored, and DNA is very stable over time. Genetic tests revealed that the skin found under Terry's fingernails had not originated from her. Marshall looked for DNA samples on the murder weapon to see if she could produce a match. But after so much time, it appeared that no traces of blood remained.
And I took apart the knife where the blade actually joined into the wooden handle, and I was digging around there with a scalpel, a clean scalpel, and I removed like really this crusty old material that was in there. And then I did process that specimen for DNA. I determined that there was 2 different DNA types there, one which matched the victim and one which matched an unknown suspect. And that DNA type from the suspect was the same that it was recovered under the fingernails.
Investigators had finally uncovered evidence that could link a suspect to the murder. Though all the circumstantial evidence was pointing to Scott Keefe, they didn't have the proof needed to obtain his DNA samples.
Trash company from Lancaster.
They would have to find another way to get the evidence they needed. Detective Whitney suggested they focus on his trash. Once trash has been placed on the curb, it is considered abandoned property in the eyes of the law. Police can legally examine and collect its contents. On trash day, investigators arranged for a garbage truck to make only one pickup: the trash in front of Scott Keefe's house. A few blocks away, police took possession of the garbage and hand-delivered it to the crime lab. Hoping to find something that contained DNA samples, Diane Marshall zeroed in on several cigarette butts recovered from the trash.
When one smokes a cigarette, one deposits their saliva on the filter. Included in that saliva are epithelial cells, which come from the lining of your mouth.
Marshall successfully extracted cellular material from 2 different brands of cigarette butts found among the debris.
So I isolated the DNA from the saliva deposited on the filters of each of the brands of the cigarettes. And I noticed that one particular brand had one specific DNA type. It did not match any of the evidence from the crime scene.
But DNA from the second brand did.
Said it was okay.
On the 15th anniversary of Terry Brooks's murder, Scott Keefe was brought in for questioning and to provide blood samples. According to Detective Nelson Whitney, he never realized he was a suspect.
We told him that he was an important witness, that he was, because of his close relationship with our victim, someone who can give us information that no one else could, that would help us in our case, and he was only too happy to help.
After answering a few questions, detectives asked if he would mind taking a polygraph test as a matter of routine. Keefe agreed. The blood samples were rushed to the lab.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, Polly, control these trash.
Hours later, while awaiting the DNA tests, Vidocq Society co-founder Bill Fleischer carefully reviewed the polygraph results.
The polygraph records these physiological changes as part of our individual defense mechanisms, known commonly as fight-flight. In a polygraph situation, we ask questions. If those questions pose a threat to your well-being because you lie to them, and there's the fear of being detected in the lie, your body immediately reacts physiologically. Heart starts to beat faster. Blood's redirected to different organs in your body. Your mouth gets dry, your knees get weak, the butterfly in the stomach, your palms get sweaty.
Though the suspect denied any involvement in Terry's murder, Fleischer concluded that Scott Keefe was being deceptive. Now, examiners looked to scientifically verify that Keefe was a murderer. When his DNA samples were compared to those recovered from the victim, examiners found a match. Police confronted the suspect with the test results. Scott Keefe had no choice but to confess. Keefe stated that he often stayed with his fiancée at the restaurant when she was working late. On the night of February 4th, 1984, Terry Brooks decided to end their engagement. Keefe flew into a rage and killed her. He then staged the scene to make it appear that the murder was the result of a robbery gone bad. After so much time, the victim's family finally had answers. Deputy District Attorney Lori Markle.
Terry Brooks's family had to live for 15 years with not knowing who had killed her or seeing that person face any measure of justice. It meant a great deal to be able to, on the morning of February 5th, 1999, go to Mr. and Mrs. Brooks and say, "We've arrested the person who killed your child. He's in custody. We've amassed considerable physical evidence against him, and he's confessed."
Scott Keefe pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. In the Terry Brooks case, a misleading crime scene led investigators to some wrong conclusions. But in some cases, detectives face a more daunting set of circumstances. No crime scene at all. On Sunday, May 19th, 1991, Jim Dunn and his wife received a late-night call at their Yardley, Pennsylvania home. The caller identified herself as Alicia Hamilton, the girlfriend of the Dunn's 24-year-old son, Scott. Upset, Alicia said Scott had disappeared from their Lubbock, Texas home. Jim told Alicia not to worry. He was expecting a call from Scott any day. But Scott never called. And Jim Dunn's attempts to reach his son were unsuccessful. Though concerned, he knew that Scott was probably busy with his hobby, buying and restoring cars.
Yes, it is. Dale, this is Jim Dunn, Scott's father.
I hadn't talked to Scott in about a week, and we'd been talking. We all usually talked at least once a week, and of course Scott was always had some kind of a project going. He was looking for money to help him buy a new car or buy a new body for a car so he could change the motors from one to the other.
But after a few days passed with no word, Jim Dunn contacted his son's boss at a car stereo installation company in Lubbock, Texas. The boss said Scott hadn't shown up for work in several days. When he last saw him, Scott hadn't been feeling well and asked to leave work early. He left his tools and his car at work and had his girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, come pick him up. Scott said he hoped to be back at work in a few days. The boss told Jim Dunn that Alicia Hamilton called the shop a few days later. She believed Scott had left her for another woman. But Scott's father didn't believe his son would simply abandon his prized cars. He contacted Lubbock police to report his son missing. But there was little investigators could do. As an adult, Scott Dunn had the right to be missing. More importantly, there was no proof that a crime had taken place. Still, Detective Tal English agreed to look into the case.
He basically told me how unusual it was for Scott to be gone at all, just to disappear like this. And Two things that he was really concerned about that concerned him was he had left his tools at his work, and he had left his car there, and had not taken either one. Those two items were extremely important to him, and Jim knew that he wouldn't just leave that.
Later that evening, detectives contacted Scott's live-in girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton. She had last seen him just hours before he disappeared. She said she brought Scott home from work after he complained of feeling sick. She put him in bed and made him some tea. She wanted to stay and take care of him, but Alicia was already late for her waitressing job. Scott insisted that she go. Alicia said goodbye and went off to work. She hadn't seen him since. Though she had no idea where Scott had gone, Alicia had discovered something unusual. While rearranging the furniture, she found that a piece of carpet underneath the sofa had been neatly cut out. Unsure of the significance, investigators asked to look around the residence. In the bedroom, they found the missing piece of carpet. It had been duct taped to the floor and was covering a bare patch of the rug.
No idea.
Alicia hadn't noticed it before. Underneath the patched carpet, investigators noticed large reddish-brown stains. They appeared to be blood.
When we saw that it looked like a crime scene, we kind of backed up. That's when our identification section was called in. They came out, and we wanted them to photograph the scene prior to actually anything being moved.
Tests confirmed that the stains were human blood. Though it was unclear if the blood had originated from missing 24-year-old Scott Dunn, the finding indicated that something violent had happened inside that bedroom. A concerned father's intuition had exposed a possible homicide. While looking for answers in the disappearance of 24-year-old Scott Dunn, police in Lubbock, Texas made a troubling discovery. In the master bedroom of the apartment the young man shared with his girlfriend, detectives discovered bloodstains underneath a section of carpet. Authorities scoured the room for more evidence. Under a light source, technicians found copious amounts of blood throughout the room. On the walls and ceiling, they found smears and streaks of more blood. It was a telltale sign that someone had tried to clean up evidence of a brutal crime. Blood samples, carpet fibers, and the duct tape from the bottom of the carpet were collected. They also retrieved Scott Dunn's hairbrush for possible DNA samples. At the crime lab, examiners successfully generated Scott Dunn's DNA profile from hairs collected from his brush. When that was compared to the ones extracted from all the blood evidence, they found a match. For Detective Tal English, there was no doubt Scott Dunn had met with foul play. But the investigation was about to face a crushing setback. Prosecutors wouldn't touch the case.
According to the district attorney's office, Texas law required a body to actually open a homicide investigation, and we didn't have that. We had evidence indicating that there was probably one that occurred, but without that body, it was going to be difficult to actually open it.
Texas authorities intensified their search for proof that Scott Dunn had been murdered. His girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, was questioned again. Though she couldn't explain the blood evidence, Alicia remained convinced Scott had run off with another woman. As the questioning continued, however, she thought of something else. She and Scott had been having problems with a neighbor, a man named Tim Smith. According to Alicia, Tim had been harassing her in recent weeks. Alicia said she met Tim at a local nightclub a few months back. She admitted that she began dating him outside of her relationship with Scott. When she realized the mistake she had made, she tried to break it off with Tim. But he couldn't seem to let go. He began to follow her and would show up at the apartment she shared with Scott.
Sure everything's okay?
She tried, according to her, to distance herself from him. Tim wouldn't let that happen. He lived in the same apartment complex at an apartment that was further down from where their apartment was, and was hanging around a lot, and she just couldn't get rid of him.
Though authorities didn't officially have a crime, they now had a potential suspect. Before looking closer at Tim Smith, however, they first needed to rule out that Scott had left town with another woman. Investigators tracked down a woman who had been spending a lot of time with Scott prior to his disappearance. She admitted she and Scott had become close friends, but nothing more. Just before he disappeared, Scott told her that he wanted to end his relationship with Alicia. But he admitted to being nervous about the confrontation. Alicia's ex-boyfriends had warned Scott she was controlling and abusive. One stated she was constantly looking for proof that he was being unfaithful. Something as innocent as a greeting card from an old friend would set Alicia off into a jealous rage. She threatened her old boyfriends with physical violence, and sometimes she tried to make good on those threats. Scott feared how Alicia would react to the news that the relationship was over. Alicia Hamilton wasn't the caring and concerned girlfriend she had presented herself as being. But that hardly proved she had anything to do with Scott's disappearance. Police paid a visit to Tim Smith, the man Alicia claimed had been harassing her and Scott. He was in the process of packing up his apartment. When detectives asked where he was going, he gave a startling answer. He and Alicia Hamilton had just bought a place and were moving in together. Tim Smith denied any involvement in Scott Dunn's disappearance. Then, officers noticed a roll of duct tape. It appeared similar to the tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. At the Lubbock Police Department Crime Lab, criminalist Scott Williams compared the tape found at Tim Smith's apartment against the tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom.
We look at the physical characteristics. This would include looking at the color, the texture, any type of embossing on the duct tape. And of course, in duct tape, there are fibers or strands running through the duct tape. We look at the spacing and what those fibers are made of.
All of the characteristics matched. Next, the chemical composition of the adhesive was analyzed. The two samples were identical in every way. And there was something else.
I noticed on the side of the roll of duct tape that there was fibers and hairs adhered to the side. I asked David Young, a person who does our hair analysis, to determine if these could have had some other common origin in the case.
Trace evidence examiner David Young compared the hairs on the roll of duct tape found in Tim Smith's apartment with ones from Scott Dunn's hairbrush. He found one consistency after another.
It basically tells us that at some point in time, Scott Dunn was around that roll of duct tape, and therefore, since we linked the duct tape to the part of the crime scene, it helped put Scott Dunn with that roll of duct tape that was possibly at the crime scene as well.
Police now had a physical link between the possible crime scene and Tim Smith's apartment. Tim Smith was now the prime suspect in a missing persons case, and his relationship with Alicia Hamilton could not be ignored. But Scott Dunn's fate remained a mystery. Until authorities could produce his body, they would be unable to prove murder. Police in Lubbock, Texas suspected that missing 24-year-old Scott Dunn had been murdered. His girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, and a man named Tim Smith were emerging as the prime suspects. But without the victim's body, they were unable to prove that harm had come to Scott Dunn. The case threatened to go cold. But Scott's father, Jim Dunn, refused to let his son's case slip away.
I'd continued to press the issue and for almost a year, and was trying to find out as much as I could about Alicia Hamilton, who she was. And also then the case had just actually had stalled because the district attorney, I'd spoken to him a couple of times, and he said, "Dunn, I don't know why you're calling me." He said, "You don't even have a body. You don't have a crime." He said, "It's just a missing person."
Determined to find justice for his son, Jim Dunn traveled to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Alicia Hamilton's hometown. He began digging into her past, looking for anything that could demonstrate she was capable of murder. He found nothing. He prepared to return home to Pennsylvania, empty-handed.
I came back to the hotel. I just relaxed and was kind of beaten down from not really finding out anything that would really help me that much, and flipped on the television set and just caught the very end of a TV show. Here was these detectives and a whole group of people called the Vidocq Society investigating unsolved homicides. And I said, my goodness, those people are right in Philadelphia, which is like 25 miles from where I live.
I was in Texas.
Jim Dunn contacted the group. Members of the Vidocq Society invited him to present the case at their upcoming gathering. After the presentation was finished, Vidocq Society co-founder Bill Fleischer spoke one-on-one with Jim Dunn.
You could see that he was beside himself, that he was a distraught father. He definitely believed that his son had been murdered. He felt that Alicia Hamilton was involved in some manner in Scott's disappearance and murder. And he was looking for help. He was a human being that was in need of help from professionals.
Authorities realized they had to first prove that a murder had taken place. Without a body, that would not be easy. Vidocq Society members turned to renowned crime scene reconstruction expert Tom Bevel for help.
Crime scene reconstruction is especially useful in cases, for example, where you don't have a body, where there's a question as to what might have taken place. Do we just have a person with a minor bleeding wound that has left on their own power, or do we have a case in which there's a serious injury, such as possibly death?
For answers, Bevel needed to determine what type of object had caused the blood spatter patterns found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. Though most of the bloodstains had been smeared in an attempt to clean up the scene, some cast-off patterns remained intact. Using an object coated with blood, he was able to recreate the size and shape of the stains observed at the crime scene. They were consistent with having been caused by a blunt object like a bat or a pipe. Having established that Scott Dunn was violently beaten, Bevel next looked to determine if the 24-year-old could have survived such an assault. For that, he would need to establish how much blood had been shed. He poured blood onto a similar piece of carpeting until the dimensions of the stains matched the ones found on the floor of Scott Dunn's bedroom. He concluded that no one could have survived the amount of blood loss necessary to replicate all of the stains. When presented with the findings, prosecutors finally agreed to take on the case. Vidocq Society experts had helped transform a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. It was the break Lubbock police had been waiting for. Now, investigators focused on finding evidence that could physically link Alicia Hamilton and Tim Smith to the murder. They began reviewing files for anything they might have overlooked. They found something. Some of the hairs recovered from the duct tape found at the crime scene had not originated from Scott Dunn. Tim Smith was brought in for questioning the following day. He continued to deny any involvement, and, eager to cooperate, he provided police with a hair sample. Alicia Hamilton provided one as well. Examiners compared the samples taken from Tim Smith and Alicia Hamilton to the unidentified hairs collected from the blood-stained duct tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. Examiners concluded that the unidentified hairs had originated from the two suspects. For authorities, the findings provided enough evidence to arrest Alicia Hamilton and Tim Smith. The couple, currently living together, were taken into custody and charged with murder. Investigators believe that when Scott Dunn tried to end his relationship with Alicia, she became enraged. Unable to handle the rejection, she lashed out and beat the young man to death. Police believe she then turned to her other boyfriend, Tim Smith, for help in cleaning up the scene and disposing of Scott's body. A jury found Alicia Hamilton guilty of murder and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Tim Smith was also found guilty of murder. He received 10 years probation. Scott Dunn's body has never been found. His father, Jim Dunn, was asked to join the Vidocq Society to help the parents of murdered victims. He agreed.
And because of my involvement there, I think as a result of being involved with the Vidocq Society and being actually a member of the Vidocq Society, that I can return a little bit and give them thanks in a different way, and at the same time maybe help someone else that was in the same position I was 10 years ago when Scott was murdered.
The Vidocq Society says its only client is truth. In that respect, they are no different from the law enforcement and forensics experts they help out. But when killers are cunning and the truth is elusive, Vidocq Society experts provide the new perspective to bring cold cases back from the brink. In Pennsylvania, a missing persons case quickly turns into a homicide investigation. Only a piece of rope can link a suspect to the murder. Detectives in Washington State discover a family brutally murdered. To expose the killer, forensic examiners look to the victim's own blood. A 13-year-old boy in Phoenix, Arizona vanishes without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to make their case. When juveniles commit murder, homicide detectives enter a realm of twisted logic. They turn to forensic examiners to follow the evidence, not the excuses, when promising lives become wasted youth. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Cambria County lies in the rural northeastern highlands of Pennsylvania. It's a small, tight-knit community that experiences few violent crimes. But on November 6, 1997, Ronald Klotz discovered that his son was missing. He told police that his 15-year-old son, Micah Pollock, never returned home from school that day. He said he and his son were very close, and it was unlike Micah to take off and not check in. Mr. Klotz explained that Micah had come to live with him the previous spring. He had moved to Pennsylvania from Ohio, where he had been living with his mother. Micah seemed happy in his new home and was enjoying making new friends. Ronald Klotz's ex-wife said she hadn't heard from Micah in some time. Though teenage boys often run away from home, Detective Greg Batcher of the Pennsylvania State Police soon learned it was unlikely that this was the case with Micah.
As we began to talk to his friends, they said that he wouldn't do that. They said that he was not the kind of person who would just up and leave. He had no reason to up and leave, and that that's when the suspicion began.
Investigators learned that the missing teenager had recently begun dating a girl from school. When questioned, the girl told police that on the day Micah disappeared, he told her he was going hunting with 16-year-old Andrew Callahan. That surprised her. Andrew Callahan was her ex-boyfriend, and he seemed to resent Micah. She explained that when she and Andrew broke up, she began seeing Micah. But Andrew was possessive and had even threatened Micah on a few occasions. Andrew couldn't seem to let go.
He was very jealous, very demanding of her, and it just, according to her, that he was just, watching her all the time. He did not want her to be with someone else.
She wasn't sure if Micah had actually gone on the hunting trip with Andrew that day. Several days passed with no word from the teenager. Police, friends, and neighbors organized a search of the area surrounding Micah's home. But their efforts turned up no clues to the missing boy's whereabouts. Desperate for a lead, police set up a roadblock nearby and questioned passing motorists. Though it seemed like a long shot, the effort paid off. A man recognized a photograph of Micah. He was in the area a few days before, and while pulled over in his vehicle, he had seen Micah with another teenager. They were heading toward an abandoned strip mine. The boy with Micah carried a shotgun over his shoulder. He thought the other teenager could have been Andrew Callahan. The next day, police and forensic technicians followed up on the lead. They traveled to the strip mines where the motorist had seen the two teenagers a few days earlier. Recent heavy rains made searching the area for clues a challenge. But soon after the search began, investigators found something that seemed out of place. It was a trash can in relatively good condition. Technicians found several red droplets on the can. They tested positive for blood. Investigators preserved the murky rainwater from inside the can for further testing. A search of the surrounding area failed to yield any additional clues. All of the evidence was forwarded to forensic examiners. At the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, criminalist Bruce Tackett first needed to determine if the bloodstains on the trash can had originated from an animal or a human. Using a chemical that reacts to proteins in human blood by turning pink, Tackett concluded the blood was human. But to generate a genetic profile from the evidence, Tackett would need additional samples. The remaining stains were too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Though there was a chance that blood was present within the liquid contents of the trash can, he realized that the rainwater had likely diluted it. The only way to extract remaining blood proteins would be to first remove the water from the sample. Tackett poured the liquid into a pan and then placed it in an evaporation chamber. In this dry environment, with an air current passing over the sample, the liquid was slowly removed and the solids became more concentrated. After most of the water had evaporated, Tackett tested the sample to see if there was any blood protein in the residue. He couldn't detect any, but he did find a potentially valuable piece of trace evidence: a single strand of human hair. Though there was no way to confirm whose hair it was, police feared it had originated from Micah Pollock. Investigators returned to the area around the strip mines where they found the trash can. This time, they brought a cadaver dog. The dog signaled to a nearby beaver pond. There, in a shallow area of the pond, searchers found the decomposed body of a young man. The victim had been shot in the back. His ankles were bound with rope and his clothes severely tattered. Through dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the week-long search for Micah Pollock had finally come to a tragic end. Micah had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun fired at close range. And based on the bruises and abrasions to the body, the examiner concluded that the teenager had been killed elsewhere, then dragged to the place where his body was found. Now, investigators turned their focus to finding the boy's killer. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan, the last person seen with Micah Pollock, was their prime suspect. With his father present, the teenager refused to answer any questions without an attorney.
Andrew, I have no choice but to arrest you.
Though the case against him was largely circumstantial, investigators placed Callahan under arrest for suspicion of murder.
Silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Detectives secured warrants to search the Callahan family's home and vehicles. Almost immediately, they found a clue.
And as we were going up the driveway, you could see something hanging from the back of the vehicle near the bumper. As we got closer, it was obvious that it was a piece of rope hanging from the vehicle.
It appeared to be the same type of rope found tied around Micah's ankles. As the team made their way to the residence, they discovered more rope on the porch. From inside the house, they retrieved 4 shotguns and a bag of hunting clothes that belonged to Andrew. All of the items were sent to the crime lab for testing. Ballistics testing on shotgun pellets is nearly impossible.
Sergeant Badger, may I help you?
And in this case, examiners were unable to demonstrate that the shotguns retrieved from the Callahan's home had been used to murder Micah Pollock. But if technicians could identify even a tiny droplet of Micah's blood on Andrew's hunting clothes, police would be one step closer to tying the suspect to the crime. But none of the clothing samples tested positive for blood.
Some of the results back in the lab. Okay, how do we make that?
Though convinced of Andrew Callahan's guilt, police couldn't seem to find a shred of physical evidence linking him to the crime. With the suspect unwilling to cooperate, investigators were running out of ways to prove that Callahan was a killer. Police in Cambria County, Pennsylvania struggled to solve the murder of 15-year-old Micah Pollock, whose bullet-ridden and tattered body was discovered in a remote pond. Though all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to 16-year-old Andrew Callahan as the killer, Pennsylvania State Police had little physical evidence to prove it. Their last hope for making their case fell to forensic scientists at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. Examiner Bruce Tackett looked for consistencies between the rope found tied around the victim's ankles and the samples collected from the suspect's residence.
When I did the rope comparison in this case, I determined that the ropes were a clothesline type rope. They had a woven or a braided cover over top of a core of fairly coarse man-made fibers. I examined all 3 of those pieces of rope that I had, determined that the construction on all of those was exactly the same.
For proof that all of the samples had originated from the same source, Tackett needed to examine the construction of the rope's core. Under a high-powered microscope, he found that the fibers that made up the core were all indistinguishable from one another.
I was able to determine that those ropes were identical in construction and that the fibers used in the construction of those ropes were the same. So essentially, those 3 pieces of rope were identical.
The rope used to bind Micah Pollock's feet had come from the same source as the rope tied to Andrew Callahan's car.
We have all this evidence against you.
When confronted with the evidence, Andrew Callahan decided to talk. He admitted that he had shot Micah while the two were hunting. He claimed that when the shooting occurred, he was tracking a bird as it flew into some nearby brush. He believed his gun was positioned at a downward angle. He didn't notice that Micah, who had been standing some distance away, was in his line of fire. Afraid that police wouldn't believe his story, he said he panicked and tried to get rid of the body.
premises, we have found the rope.
Looking to corroborate the suspect's story, police turned to the evidence for answers.
And found on the front porch.
From powder burns observed on Micah's body, the medical examiner concluded that the gun was no more than 3 feet away when it discharged. And the shotgun pellets that entered the victim's back came to rest near his jaw. The weapon had been held at an upward angle, contradicting Callahan's claim that he had been aiming at the ground when Micah was shot. Police believe that Callahan went hunting that day with only one target in mind.
I got another one over there up on the hill there last year, and there's this
The teenager
down this
who was
way.
now dating his ex-girlfriend. Pennsylvania State Police Detective Greg Batcher believed that after the shooting, Andrew systematically went about covering up his actions.
He purchased the garbage can at the store and then returned to the scene. At some point in time, he also gathered a piece of clothesline from his residence. He took these items to the scene, back to where the body was lying.
But when Micah Pollock's body wouldn't fit in the garbage can, he used rope to drag the body some 400 feet behind his car until he reached a remote spot. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan was tried as an adult. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Police believe that irrational jealousy drove Andrew Callahan to murder his rival. But sometimes, investigators can find no motive at all. A suburb of Seattle, the Woodbridge section of Bellevue, Washington, is a quiet neighborhood. One that is unfamiliar with brutal crime. On January 5th, 1997, a morning 911 call brought Bellevue police to a secluded park. A passerby had discovered the lifeless body of a young woman. A rope fastened tightly around the victim's neck made it clear she had been murdered. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this victim was.
No other visible signs of injury.
Lying near the body, they found a checkbook. The account was in the name of Karen White, and it listed a San Diego address. Bellevue police searched through records looking for a Karen White who matched the victim's description. Homicide detective Jeff Gomes found a potential match. A 20-year-old woman with that name and physical description listed a previous address just a few blocks from the park where the body was found. After confirming it was the same Karen White that had been found murdered, Detective Gomes had the grim task of making the notification.
As a detective, one of the most difficult tasks you have is notifying next of kin of a death in their family. I don't enjoy it. It's very difficult to do.
Several hours after the body was recovered, detectives went to the White home. Though several cars were parked in the driveway, the house was dark. No one appeared to be home. Detectives discovered an unlocked door. Fearing that someone could be in danger, one of the officers entered the property. The house was eerily silent. It appeared the residence had been robbed. After finding no one downstairs, the detective proceeded to the upper floors. As he approached a bedroom, he noticed bloodstains on the outside of the door. When he looked inside, he discovered the lifeless body of a teenage girl. She had been viciously beaten and stabbed to death. He yelled for his partner to call in for backup. Next, he followed a trail of blood that led down the hall into another room. There, he found another grisly scene. A middle-aged couple lay dead. Their skulls had been crushed, and they'd been stabbed repeatedly. The victims were later identified as 17-year-old Janet White and her parents, Regina and Walter White. They were the immediate family of the young woman found murdered in the park just hours earlier. Forensic technicians began searching for clues to help them reconstruct what happened. All of the victims had been savagely beaten with a blunt object and then stabbed dozens of times in the face and neck. Police photographed and swabbed dozens of bloodstains. The only real clues to the killer's identity were bloody boot prints found on the carpet and one on the back of Walter White's shirt. Though the triple murder at the White residence appeared to be the result of a robbery gone bad, that didn't explain the murder of Karen White just a few blocks away.
Well, just the area around the water tower, the picnic area and stuff, there looked like there's some activity of people being up there, but we don't know if it's related to the crime or not. There's not a whole bunch of stuff.
In a community that witnessed few homicides, police were convinced that finding an entire family murdered in one day was more than a coincidence.
The main question was, are these scenes connected? Was that the same suspect acting in both scenes? Was it a one-time incident where a person killed this family, or was it a serial killer?
Despite the lingering questions, police were faced with the reality that at least one brutal killer was on the loose in the city of Bellevue. And until they could identify a suspect or an apparent motive, police were powerless to stop him from killing again. While searching for answers in the strangulation murder of 20-year-old Karen White, Bellevue, Washington police made a shocking discovery. A few blocks away from where her body was found, detectives discovered that her parents, Regina and Walter White, and her 17-year-old sister Janet had been brutally beaten and stabbed to death in their home. Police focused their investigation on Karen's murder, believing that her killer was responsible for the other 3 homicides. Through interviews, investigators learned that before Karen moved to San Diego to become a volunteer in the AmeriCorps program, she associated with a tightly knit group of teenagers who were part of a movement referred to as goth.
It's young teenagers dressing all in black, painting their faces white, dyeing their hair. They sometimes pretend to be vampires with fang teeth, and they dress the part. Witches, they pretend to be witches.
Police learned that one of those friends had seen Karen the night before her body was discovered. The friend had stopped by the White residence. Karen had come back to Bellevue for a few days to visit her family. That night, Karen wanted to run out and do some last-minute errands before returning to San Diego the following day. After being dropped off at home a few hours later, Karen said she still had one more errand to run. She wanted to see a teenager named David Anderson, who owed her some money. The friend decided not to go along. Police jumped on the lead. Under questioning, David Anderson, a 17-year-old high school student, confirmed he and Karen White were friends. But he said he hadn't seen her since she had come back into town. On the night of the murder, he stated he was at a friend's house all night. He and his friend never left. When asked if he owned any boots, Anderson said he had one pair and retrieved them for the detective. But it was clear that the sole pattern on his boots did not resemble the bloody prints recovered from the victim's residence. Frustrated, investigators continued interviewing Karen White's friends. One believed she had important information. She said that on the night of the murders, David Anderson had been at her apartment hanging out with her roommate. Around 10 p.m., Anderson and her roommate, 17-year-old Alex Barani, decided to go out. She recalled that Alex had something stuffed inside the sleeve of his overcoat. She thought it was a bat or a club. The woman fell asleep a short while later and was unsure what time the two returned to the apartment. Having caught David Anderson in a lie, police turned to his friend Alex Barani for additional information. Alex was cooperative and even friendly with police. He insisted he and David had been home all night. But when detectives confronted him with his roommate's statements, his demeanor changed. Homicide detective Bob Thompson.
His chin began to quiver. He immediately started sweating, and he became visibly nervous. I, at that time, decided, I think this guy did the murder.
Under persistent questioning, Alex Barani unraveled. The 17-year-old confessed to all 4 murders. He said after leaving the apartment, he dropped David Anderson off at his girlfriend's house and then went to the park alone to meet Karen White. He planned to tell Karen that David would be unable to pay back the money he owed her. On his way there, he decided he wanted to know what it was like to kill. He strangled the young woman. Fearing that Karen had told her parents her plans, Alex went to her home and bludgeoned and stabbed the family to death. Alex Barani said he had thrown away his boots that had left the prints found at the crime scene.
You have the right to remain silent.
He was placed under arrest and charged with the 4 murders. Though Alex had confessed to the murders, investigators knew from experience that they still needed to scientifically corroborate his statements. And they were unconvinced that he had acted alone. All of the crime scene photographs from the White's residence were sent to renowned blood spatter expert Ross Gardner in Georgia. Gardner looked to reconstruct the triple murder, one droplet of blood at a time.
Most of your forensic evidence tells you who was involved in a crime. But what happened at the crime and how it happened is sometimes very significant. And bloodstain patterns speak to those events that created the bloodstains. They tell us what happened and how it happened.
Using bloodstain patterns observed in the photographs, Gardner first looked to establish what types of weapons had been used in the murders. He recognized 2 distinct cast-off patterns. The first type of pattern was consistent with having been caused by sharp force trauma, most likely by the blade of a knife.
The size of the stains are very small, and here in particular, very similar to what we saw on the scene. And the reason being is we have a very thin edge on which the blood can accumulate as it's being cast off.
A larger, blunt instrument made the second type of bloodstain pattern that Gardner identified.
If we were to observe a cast-off that is the result of a club or a bloody hand being swung, something like that, we're going to see a significantly different kind of cast-off. We're going to see larger stains, greater volume, and they're going to develop over a little bit wider area.
Next, Gardner set out to understand the sequence of events inside the master bedroom. His first clue came from the tiny bloodstains found on the back of Walter White's t-shirt. Those stains had originated from his wife, Regina. That suggested that she had been the first victim, attacked in the couple's bed while her husband lay sleeping beside her.
The father had his back to his wife as she was being attacked in the very early stages of the blunt force attack, because it was very tiny spatter that impacted on the back of his t-shirt.
To understand what happened next, Gardner entered the coordinates of all of the bloodstains found in the room into a computer database. Then, specially designed forensic software was applied to the data. The location and pattern of the father's blood found next to the bed suggested he was attacked with a knife as he tried to get up. A trail of his blood led from that spot to the foot of the bed, where his body finally came to rest. There, more of the father's blood was found spattered on the walls, indicating he came under attack a second time. Those cast-off patterns had been caused by both a knife and a blunt object.
When we took the combination of all the stains that were found in this corner, it really demanded, there was really no other explanation but that this spatter event was occurring and the sharp force was occurring from the other side.
The stains indicated that the attacker stood in front of the victim's head when beating him with a blunt object, which caused his blood to eject into the scene in a radiating pattern. But Gardner found no blood spatter on the surface of one section of wall. The only explanation for the finding was that there was a second attacker standing in front of that wall. Lastly, the blood evidence showed that 17-year-old Janet rushed to her parents' room, but then was attacked and then dragged back to her room, where she became the final victim. Gardner's analysis was consistent with Alex Barani's confession, with one major exception. He had not acted alone. And investigators believed that Alex was protecting his friend, David Anderson. Police obtained a warrant to search the vehicle David Anderson had driven on the night of the murders. They found a length of rope on the front seat. Forensic examiners concluded that it was the same type of rope used to strangle 20-year-old Karen White. David Anderson was also charged with 4 counts of murder. Police believe that David Anderson and Alex Barani murdered Karen White at the park, motivated by sick curiosity. They next set their sights on the victim's entire family. Based on their complete disregard for human life, Alex Barani and David Anderson were tried as adults. Both received 4 consecutive life sentences. In Washington state, analysis of the crime scene helped expose a second killer's identity. But when police are unable to locate a victim's body, proving murder is much more difficult. In the late afternoon hours of November 10, 1995, Rhonda Mitchie entered the Phoenix Police Department to report her child missing. She hadn't heard from her 13-year-old son, Brad Hansen, in nearly 12 hours. Though Brad was a responsible and loving son, he seemed to be going through a rebellious phase.
He's 13 years old. He was on a bike.
In fact, Brad had been recently grounded, and he was supposed to come straight home after school. After saying goodbye to him earlier that morning, Rhonda, a single mom, went to work. She later learned that there were no classes that day. She called Brad's pager and contacted several of his friends. But the 13-year-old never called back, and his friends hadn't seen him that day. Detective Sally Dillion agreed to look into the case. She was optimistic that there would be a quick resolution.
We thought he'd ran away from home, that he was staying with a friend, and, you know, that in a day or two, 3, that he would return home.
But after several days went by without a word, authorities several hundred miles away in California were dispatched to the home of Brad Hansen's father. Investigators hoped they would find the boy there. But Mr. Hansen had not heard from Brad in some time, and he was troubled that his son had not checked in. Phoenix police distributed photographs and a description of the missing boy throughout the area. But no clues to his whereabouts surfaced. A search of the desert and mountain areas outside of Phoenix also turned up nothing. Brad Hansen seemed to have vanished without a trace. Police in Phoenix, Arizona continued searching for 13-year-old Brad Hansen, who had been reported missing by his mother. Having uncovered no clues to the boy's whereabouts, detectives began questioning his classmates. Brad's girlfriend, Jennifer, said that on the day he disappeared, she went over to a friend's house to hang out. Brad was also supposed to be there. But when Jennifer arrived at her friend Jeremy Bach's house, she learned Brad was no longer there. He had left his favorite ski cap behind. Then, in the kitchen, she noticed a hole in the wall. There was also a reddish-brown stain on the floor. 13-year-old Jeremy told her that he and Brad had been playing cops and robbers with his stepfather's guns. Not knowing that the guns were loaded, Jeremy said that Brad pulled the trigger, firing a round into the wall. The stain on the floor, he said, was ketchup. Jeremy told Jennifer that after the gun went off, Brad rushed out of the house, afraid that he would get into trouble. He didn't know where Brad went, and he hadn't heard from him since. Jennifer hadn't heard from him either. Investigators arranged to interview Jeremy Bach and his stepfather. Jeremy told the same story he had relayed to his friend, Jennifer. But when pressed on specific details, Detective Sally Dillion sensed that he wasn't telling the entire truth.
There were parts of it that we had a notion were probably going to be true, and other parts that you could tell weren't. Times when he would make the eye contact and other times when he wouldn't.
As investigators struggled to figure out what Jeremy was hiding, word came in that another classmate wanted to speak with police. In the principal's office at the nearby junior high school, police questioned one of the missing boy's friends. He believed that Jeremy Bach had done something to Brad Hansen. It was well known around school that Brad and Jennifer were boyfriend and girlfriend. And it was also known that Jeremy was extremely jealous. He also liked Jennifer. And though he and Brad were friends, Jeremy tried to break up the young couple's relationship. According to the classmate, Jeremy had been bragging that he was going to hurt Brad. Investigators feared Jeremy Bach had made good on his threat. But to prove that a crime had been committed, they needed to locate the victim's body.
Kevin's gonna meet us down there.
To do that, they struggled to put themselves inside the mind of a 13-year-old killer, one who didn't have access to a car.
We really had nothing, so we tried to figure out what we could do, and the only thing that we came up with is we put him in the trash.
Detectives formulated a plan. Once a dumpster is put out on the curb, it is considered public property in the eyes of the law. 2 weeks after Brad Hansen was reported missing, police returned to the Bach residence. After the trash was put on the curb, investigators confiscated the can and then replaced it with another one. Once the trash can was secured in an evidence property room, Detective Dillian contacted forensic examiners at the Phoenix Police Department's crime lab. As soon as the lid was opened, investigators knew their instincts had been dead on. Large stains and dried liquid pooled in the bottom tested positive for human blood. And forensic scientist Kevin Knapp didn't believe anyone could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention.
The dumpster is probably about 2 feet in diameter, and there was probably about an inch deep pool of blood, dried blood, in the bottom of the dumpster. So even without being a medical examiner, in my opinion, it was an awful lot of blood, more than I typically see in a case.
Now, examiners needed to verify that the blood found inside the trash can had originated from 13-year-old Brad Hansen. But there were no DNA samples from Brad to use for comparisons. Knapp had another option to get the evidence he needed.
We all get our DNA from our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. So you can look at a DNA profile from an offspring and determine whether or not the DNA pattern from the parents could have formed that child.
When the DNA samples collected from the trash can were compared to the genetic profiles of Brad's parents, examiners found a match. Detectives confronted the 13-year-old suspect with their findings. Now, Jeremy Bach claimed that while playing cops and robbers, his hand accidentally hit the countertop and the gun he was holding discharged. Sending Brad Hansen flying backwards into the wall. He didn't realize that his finger was on the trigger. Panicked, he cleaned up the blood and disposed of the body. For investigators, Jeremy's story stretched credibility.
He had said that when Brad was hit by the bullet that he flew back and he hit the wall. Well, very seldom does someone fly back. That's movies, okay, that's theatrics. Normally when somebody gets shot by a bullet, they drop. So there were things that he was recounting to us that we did not feel were totally accurate.
Detectives returned to the Bach residence with a search warrant. They collected the 2 handguns that Jeremy's stepfather kept in the house, including the .357 Magnum revolver used in the shooting. And though investigators found traces of Brad Hansen's blood in the kitchen, the findings did little to refute Jeremy's claim that the shooting was accidental. As long as investigators were unable to locate the victim's body, proving murder would be difficult. Blood evidence convinced Phoenix police that missing 13-year-old Brad Hansen was dead. Though they had been unable to locate his body, his classmate, Jeremy Bach, claimed that he accidentally shot the boy while they played cops and robbers. In a panic, he said he disposed of Brad's body in the trash. But investigators suspected that Brad Hansen had been murdered out of jealousy. Now they needed to prove it. Police turned to forensic examiners for help. At the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, firearms expert Mahesh Patel looked for evidence that could prove whether or not the shooting was an accident.
The scenario that was given to me was that Jeremy might have struck the side of the edge of the table and might have accidentally discharged the firearm.
The .357 was constructed with a hammer block, which is designed to prevent it from discharging if accidentally dropped or bumped. Though incriminating, that didn't prove that Jeremy had intentionally fired the weapon. Patel needed to determine how much force had to be applied to the trigger in order to fire the weapon.
What we do is take a set of weights and hang them from the trigger and keep adding on weight to the end of the trigger till it actually goes off, and that will tell us how much force was required for that particular firearm.
Patel determined that 10 1/4 pounds of pressure was required to fire the .357 Magnum revolver. He concluded that an accidental flinch would not have been enough to cause the gun to fire. The analysis indicated that Jeremy Bach intentionally pulled the trigger. 13-year-old Jeremy Bach was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Authorities believe that Jeremy invited his friend Brad Hansen to his house and then confronted him about Brad and Jennifer's blossoming relationship. Driven by a jealous rage, Jeremy grabbed his stepfather's gun and shot Brad. Jeremy Bach, the youngest person to be tried as an adult in the state of Arizona, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Brad Hansen's body has never been found. Sometimes, juveniles believe that homicide is the answer to their problems. When that happens, investigators and forensic scientists must focus on the facts, which can turn dreams of a promising future into the reality of a wasted youth. A store clerk is killed during a robbery in Tennessee. When the suspect claims it was an accident, police turn to forensic examiners to prove cold-blooded murder. 2 people are found brutally murdered in an Albany, New York boarding house. To capture the killer, investigators rely on 19th century technology. In Louisiana, a fisherman discovers the body of a murdered woman. A footprint left in blood is investigators' only clue to her killer's identity. When there are no witnesses to a murder, police must find other ways to solve their case. But unseen no longer means unobserved, and killers are finding themselves caught in the camera's eye. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. In the early morning hours of July 2nd, 1995, police in Chattanooga, Tennessee received a 911 call. A man had discovered the bullet-ridden body of a store clerk inside a local gas station convenience store. Investigators and forensic technicians from the Chattanooga Police Department responded to the scene. In the back storage room, detectives located the male victim. The manager later identified him as 34-year-old employee Lenny King. He had been shot in the arm and twice in the chest by a large caliber weapon that had been fired at close range. Investigators found handcuffs locked to the sink next to the victim's body. As technicians began processing the scene for evidence, they found bloodstains on the outside of the door leading into the storage room. Examiners determined that the blood had originated from the victim. The team next made their way into the service area of the store. The cash register and safe had been cleaned out. The homicide appeared to be the result of a robbery gone bad. The killer had made off with more than $2,000. But technicians were unable to locate any fingerprints left behind by the robber. Investigators hoped that the store's security cameras could provide some clues. When the manager played the surveillance tape, investigators realized the suspect had been caught on video entering the store. And as the manager watched images of the cash register and safe being cleaned out, he believed he recognized the robber. It looked like a former employee named Jason Rhodes. The manager pulled his files, looking for more information. According to employment records, the 22-year-old had only worked at the store for a few weeks. And the victim, Lenny King, had trained him. According to the manager, Lenny King was a well-liked and valued employee who treated everyone with kindness. But King had complained that Jason Rhodes was lazy and inattentive, and Jason didn't take the job very seriously. After his training period was over, Jason only showed up for work once and then quit. At the police station, detectives reviewed the surveillance video again. The tape, which consisted of a series of still photographs shot every 2 seconds, simultaneously displayed images from the store's 2 security cameras. As they watched the images frame by frame, they noticed that the suspect was brandishing what appeared to be a .357 revolver as he walked into the store. But a time and date stamp on the video obscured the image of the victim being approached by the gunman and forced into the storage room. And that room, where the victim was killed, was out of the camera's range. Investigators were able to print a clear image of the gunman. To confirm the killer's identity, police showed a photograph of the suspect to Jason Rhodes' father. Heartbroken by what he saw, Mr. Rhodes positively identified the man in the photo as his son. When asked if he knew his son's present whereabouts, the father said that Jason and his girlfriend, Sonia Altman, had left town the same day Lenny King was found murdered. Jason hadn't told his father why he was leaving, but he did say that he probably would not be coming home. Mr. Rhodes gave investigators a description of his son's truck. Police had positively identified Lenny King's killer. And based on the senselessness of the murder, Sergeant Rodney Bowman knew they needed to apprehend Jason Rhodes quickly.
Well, we're looking for a young man that definitely didn't have any value to life. We really at that time had no idea if he might be drug-induced or what his behavior was. All we knew is that this was a deliberate act. It appeared to be a deliberate act, and we needed to get this man off the street.
Detectives theorized that the suspect and his girlfriend would eventually contact their loved ones. They began tracing all the calls made to members of their families. Within hours, the tactic paid off. Jason's girlfriend, Sonia Altman, had contacted her grandmother, and the call was traced to a hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. Descriptions of the suspect, his girlfriend, and the vehicle they were traveling in were forwarded to the Nashville police. On the evening of July 3rd, Nashville authorities spotted Jason Rhodes' truck as it pulled into a gas station. As the suspect exited his vehicle to fill up, detectives moved in. Jason Rhodes was placed under arrest on suspicion of aggravated robbery and murder. His girlfriend, Sonia Altman, was also placed under arrest. Investigators began searching the suspect's vehicle. On the front seat, police found a money bag that contained several $100s in cash. Detectives also found a box of ammunition for a .357 handgun, the same type as the one used to murder Lenny King. The following day, Chattanooga police traveled to Nashville to question Jason Rhodes about the homicide. At first, he denied any knowledge of the crime. But when confronted with the evidence against him, he decided to cooperate. Jason admitted to killing Lenny King. But he said it was a horrible accident. He never intended to harm his former co-worker. According to Jason, he entered the store with the intent to commit robbery. He claimed that he brought the victim into the storage room in order to handcuff him to the sink, so he would be unable to trip any alarm devices. But as he attempted to get the cuffs around Lenny King's wrist, the store clerk fought back, grabbing for the gun.
He fell to the ground and he tried to grab the gun.
Several shots went off, and Jason realized that Lenny had been hit.
I didn't know what was going to happen.
Panicked, he grabbed the money and fled the scene. Though Jason Rhodes had confessed to killing Lenny King inside the storage room, investigators didn't believe the story. Blood found on the outside of the doorframe suggested that the victim had been shot well before the two entered the room and struggled. But unless investigators could prove that Jason Rhodes was lying, he would likely stand trial for a lesser manslaughter charge. Detectives were convinced Jason Rhodes was a cold-blooded killer. Now they needed to find proof to ensure that the young man would never be free to kill again. Police in Chattanooga, Tennessee had arrested the man responsible for the murder of 34-year-old store clerk Lenny King, shot to death during the commission of a robbery. After being caught on the store's surveillance video, Jason Rhodes admitted to the killing. But he claimed his gun had accidentally gone off as he and the victim struggled in the storage room. Detectives scrutinized the video frame by frame, looking for proof that Jason Rhodes was lying and that the murder had been premeditated. Then, in one of the frames, they noticed that the victim's knees appeared to buckle, and he grabbed for his arm soon after Jason Rhodes entered the store. Homicide Detective Sergeant Tim Carroll theorized the suspect began shooting as soon as he walked in.
Once we got the video slowed down where we could see it, Sergeant Rodney Bowman and I both agreed that Jason Rhodes came in the store and shot from the get-go. It wasn't just going in the back of the storeroom and wrestling around and gun going off.
Investigators knew that if they could prove Jason Rhodes fired as soon as he entered the store, they could charge him with premeditated first-degree murder. But that would not be easy.
Where Jason Rhodes is positioned in the video, it's underneath all this date and time stamping. We can't see any muzzle flash, we can't see the weapon actually jerk. So our theory is we got to get this video enhanced where we can either eliminate the wording or can we see a muzzle flash.
Investigators turned to scientists at the U.S. Department of Energy's Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There, Ken Tobin heads the Image Science and Machine Vision Group. His expertise lies in analyzing video images in order to extract data that is not readily visible. He agreed to work the case.
The tape that we received from the Chattanooga Police Department was typical low quality. It had a split screen characteristic, which meant there were two video cameras that were in the actual store where the robbery took place. They were both displayed simultaneously on the camera. But the camera that actually caught the shooting of the store proprietor had him very far away. It was obscured by the time and date stamp, which was posted in the upper left-hand quadrant of the image, and it didn't look very possible to see anything new.
To confirm investigators' suspicions that Lenny King was fired upon before entering the back room, Tobin needed a clear image. First, he would have to remove the date and time stamp from the video. To do that, he applied computer software to the images as part of a process referred to as subtraction analysis. The analysis works by comparing each frame of video to the next, and then eliminating images that remain constant and unchanged throughout.
So the subtraction process in this case, the goal is to remove everything that's constant in the scene. The shelves, the coffee pot, the time and date stamp, which was superimposed over part of the image, and leave nothing but, for example, in this case, the muzzle flash itself and the recoil of the body, the person holding the gun as it was fired.
Through subtraction analysis, Tobin was able to capture a blip in the video that was previously obscured by the time and date stamp. And it appeared to be the muzzle flash from Jason Rhodes' gun. Tobin's analysis had brought investigators one step closer to proving that Jason Rhodes had entered the convenience store with the intent to kill Lenny King. But to win a first-degree murder conviction, they needed to be certain that the blip uncovered by Tobin's analysis was in fact a muzzle flash and not a glitch in the video itself. To find out, detectives returned to the convenience store to conduct their own experiment. Using the same .357 Magnum revolver used in the murder, they fired the weapon into old phone books, making certain to be in view of the store's surveillance cameras.
We fired into like a couple of old city directories in that same corner area, but not in the same area where this time stamping was. So we fired several rounds and of course recorded on the store surveillance film, and then our crime scene people also videotaped it as well.
Likelihood that this is consistent with a
The video of the reconstruction was sent to Ken Tobin for a comparison with the one taken during the actual crime. When he compared the muzzle flash from Sergeant Carroll's gun to the blip on the video taken at the time of the murder, he concluded they were consistent in shape and intensity. Investigators now had the evidence they needed to prove that Jason Rhodes' story was a lie. And one isolated frame of video had been the difference in proving first-degree murder.
I would compare what Oak Ridge National Lab did on this one little section of video to one drop or hair of DNA. It was that crucial. Without what they did, we didn't have what I would consider the video DNA for this case.
To avoid the death penalty, Jason Rhodes, on the advice of his attorney, pled guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated murder. Police believe Jason Rhodes entered the store knowing he would kill the clerk who could identify him. After shooting him in the arm as he walked in, Rhodes forced Lenny King into the storage room. After a struggle for the gun, Jason shot the victim twice more in the chest at close range. He exited the back room and proceeded to rob the store of $2,000 in cash. Jason Rhodes was sentenced to life in prison. His girlfriend, Sonia Altman, was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Jason Rhodes' crime was exposed through state-of-the-art technology. But to solve a double murder in Albany, New York, investigators must rely on a 19th century invention. On the morning of July 3rd, 1994, Gary Lang went to check on his mother-in-law at a boarding house that she owned and operated. When he arrived, he noticed her stereo on the steps. The mail hadn't been collected, and the back door was wide open. Inside, the house was in shambles. Then, lying on the kitchen floor, he discovered the brutally beaten bodies of his 86-year-old mother-in-law, Josephine Zurich, and a tenant, Walter Peskowski. Investigators from the Albany Police Department rushed to the home. Police technicians carefully documented the entire house. Blood and debris were everywhere. Detective Anthony Bruno was shocked by what he saw.
The house looked literally as if someone had picked it up and shaken it and set it back down. I don't think, aside from the kitchen table, there was a piece of furniture that wasn't turned over. There wasn't a drawer that hadn't been pulled out and emptied, thrown on the floor. The kitchen itself was covered in blood. There was nowhere to walk on the kitchen floor without stepping in blood.
The blood stain patterns found throughout the kitchen were consistent with having been caused by blunt force trauma injuries. And it was likely that a cane with a bloody handle found on the floor was the weapon used to bludgeon the elderly victims. As investigators struggled to find evidence that could point them toward the killer, they uncovered another possible weapon. On top of the kitchen table, they found a cooking pot, dented and stained with blood. For investigators, all of the evidence suggested that the two victims had unwittingly stumbled upon a robbery in progress. And it appeared that the killer or killers had left in a hurry. Autopsies confirmed that both victims had died as a result of massive blunt force trauma to the head. 55-year-old Walter Peskowski had also been strangled. Each of the victims had been struck dozens of times. And the injuries were consistent with having been caused by both the cane and the pot found in the kitchen. The medical examiner determined that the murders had likely occurred between 10 and 11 p.m. the previous evening. Hopeful that the evidence recovered from the crime scene might yield some clue to the killer's identity, detectives brought it to the Albany Police Crime Lab. While processing the bloody pot believed to have been used as a weapon, Detective Dean Halprin noticed what appeared to be a fingerprint on the inside wall. And if it was in fact a print, recovering it would not be easy.
The material the pot was made out of isn't something that we've had good results with because it has pock marks, depressions, plus it's very bent out of shape from being struck against the victims. But after it was actually processed with the powder, we could see that we had something in there. We had a print.
But the excitement was short-lived. Though investigators had found evidence that could place a suspect at the scene, they couldn't get the camera in the position necessary to obtain a detailed image. Without that, they would be unable to compare it to a suspect print, if and when one emerged.
The pot is small, difficult to stick a camera in and get a good picture. Numerous attempts were made at doing that. And we had pictures of the print, but they were not of the quality needed to make an identification.
Examiners concluded that any attempt to lift the print with adhesive would likely destroy it. And dismantling the murder weapon was not an option.
I think they'll be able to.
As evidence, the print appeared to be useless.
Thanks.
Investigators would have to find another way to identify the killer. Police turned to Josephine Zurich's son-in-law, Gary Lang, for help. After listening to him describe his mother-in-law, police couldn't imagine why anyone would have wanted to harm her.
Josephine Zurich was an 86-year-old Polish immigrant who had lived in that home, raised her family there since she immigrated to the United States. She was a law-abiding citizen. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was known for baking pies for people in the neighborhood.
The son-in-law added that Walter Paskowski, a tenant in the house, had also become close to Josephine and the family. Gary said that he and his wife stopped by the boarding house regularly, bringing groceries and offering to help out as often as they could. He recalled that Josephine had recently had problems with one of the younger tenants who rented the basement apartment.
I don't know.
In fact, she had started legal eviction proceedings against him when he suddenly moved out of the building. The son-in-law provided investigators with the former tenant's name. A records check revealed that the man currently worked as a cook at a hotel restaurant in the Albany Capital District. Believing they had identified a suspect in the killings, investigators quickly contacted the former tenant and arranged to speak with him. At first, he appeared apprehensive and seemed reluctant to answer any questions. But when police informed him about the murders, he decided to cooperate. He admitted that he moved out after having run-ins with Josephine and Walter. But he insisted he would never harm either of them. On the night of the murders, he claimed he had been working late at the restaurant. Homicide detective Bernard Santandrea began digging deeper into the former tenant's background. But nothing he learned indicated that the young man could be involved in such a brutal double homicide.
This was an horrific act of violence. We just didn't feel this man had this in his nature to do it. Now, that being said, we also verified his whereabouts and his place of employment, and was verified that during the time we felt the homicides occurred, this individual was working.
The investigation was back at square one. With no suspects in the savage double murders, the case threatened to go cold. And that meant a violent killer was still loose on the streets of Albany. Police in Albany, New York struggled to solve a brutal double homicide at a boarding house that had claimed the lives of the owner, 86-year-old Josephine Zurich, and 55-year-old tenant Walter Paskowski. Though forensic examiners had located a suspect's fingerprint on a cooking pot used to bludgeon the victims, attempts to recover it had been unsuccessful. Homicide detective Anthony Bruno struggled to identify the killer.
We really had a whodunit. These folks had no connections to any wrongdoings, or they were not criminal element. It was difficult to figure out who would have a motive to savagely beat these two people to death, aside from the burglary, which we believed happened.
Police turned to the public for help. 2 days after the murders, a woman contacted detectives. After reading the details of the crime in the local paper, she believed that her ex-boyfriend might be involved in the homicides. Around midnight on the evening of the murders, the woman's ex-boyfriend, Johnny Blanchard, had stopped by her apartment unannounced. He seemed agitated and was sweating and out of breath. The girlfriend noticed blood on his clothes. Johnny explained he had been injured in a fight. But as he changed out of the bloody clothes, there were no injuries visible on his body. He refused to answer any more of her questions and left. She hadn't heard from him since. Johnny Blanchard was well known to Homicide Detective Sergeant Bernard Santandrea. He had an extensive criminal record, which included drug charges and violent assaults.
Johnny Blanchard was familiar to me and other investigators in the office. We've known him over the years, knew that he had a propensity for violence, that he would be the type of personality that could commit such a crime.
Blanchard's records revealed that he had grown up in a house close to where the murders occurred. And he was rumored to be currently squatting in an abandoned home located next door to the victim's residence. Police believed they had finally identified a suspect in the murders. Now they needed to find Johnny Blanchard. His photograph was distributed to all area patrol officers. The following evening, Albany police spotted Johnny Blanchard hanging out near a downtown alley. He was placed under arrest and brought in to speak with homicide detectives. Under questioning, Blanchard was arrogant and uncooperative. He denied knowing the victims and insisted he had no information about the murders. After requesting that a lawyer be present, he asked to make a phone call.
After a few hours of questioning, Johnny finally asked if he could call his former girlfriend on the telephone, and he wanted to speak to her before he spoke any further to us.
Blanchard wanted to find out what his ex-girlfriend had told police. But while he was on the phone, he was overheard admitting that he had stolen a television and some jewelry from the boarding house. When police confronted the suspect with the information, his attorney showed up. And he refused to allow his client to answer any more questions. Though police had overheard a partial confession, they knew it would never be allowed in as evidence in a murder trial. Still, it gave them an opportunity. The owner of the vacant house where Blanchard had been squatting allowed investigators to search the property. There, they recovered a television set and some jewelry that was later identified as belonging to victim Josephine Zurich. Though convinced of Johnny Blanchard's guilt, investigators knew their case was still only circumstantial. To prove murder, they needed hard evidence that could place the suspect at the scene of the crime. Though a fingerprint had been located on one of the murder weapons, police had been unable to get a clear image of the print. Investigators turned to forensic experts at the Connecticut State Police Crime Lab. There, specialist Paul Penders agreed to work the case. After examining the print inside the pot, he realized there would be only one way to get Albany police the evidence they needed to make their case.
We knew that there were some difficulties with lifting the print, it being a blood print and so forth, and it would have to be pretty much done off the photography. The comparison would have to be made with a photograph.
But that was easier said than done. Penders would have to find a way to precisely place a camera inside the pot in order to generate a clear image of the evidence.
This impression is inside the pot, in the side of the pot, and we need to get a photograph of it straight down from 90 degrees to produce an actual size photograph. You couldn't get a conventional camera in that.
Then, Penders had an idea. Though modern cameras could not be manipulated into the position needed, older cameras could. He decided to use a 19th century bellows camera, which was constructed using what is called a slide rail system. The slide rail allows the lens to be moved or slid into place, detached from the body of the camera. The system allows for greater access to images that are in hard-to-reach locations. Penders was able to slide his lens directly over the latent fingerprint. The film is another key component of the process. Each frame of film is 4 inches by 5 inches, much larger than the standard 35mm width.
The major advantage of the 4x5 camera is you photograph the object already its exact size. So it's already life size. There's no question about enlarging it or reducing it. And the amount of information on that large piece of film far surpasses what a 35mm frame can give you.
The procedure was successful. Using his bellows camera with the slide rail system, Paul Penders was able to get a high contrast photograph of the fingerprint inside the pot. Now, examiners looked to the evidence to prove that Johnny Blanchard had carried out the murders. When the print photographed from inside the pot was compared with known fingerprints taken from Blanchard, examiners concluded they were identical.
Is that our man there?
Johnny Blanchard was subsequently charged with 2 counts of murder. Based on the evidence, investigators believe that Johnny Blanchard broke into the boarding house intent on robbing the place. But when 86-year-old Josephine Zurich and 55-year-old Walter Paskowski interrupted the burglary, Blanchard reacted by savagely beating them to death. Johnny Blanchard was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, depraved indifference, and burglary. He was sentenced to 60 years to life. Suspects with no obvious connections to their victims are difficult to identify. But oftentimes, murders are carried out by those closest to the victim. Just across the Mississippi state line, the Pearl River in southeastern Louisiana is known to sport fishermen as a haven for largemouth bass. On May 21, 1996, a man headed toward the river in search of a perfect fishing spot. As he made his way through a small clearing, he discovered a decomposed human body. The fisherman quickly summoned police. Within minutes, officers and forensic technicians from the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Department arrived at the location. Before they began processing the scene, however, crime scene photographers thoroughly documented the entire area. And it was a mess. investigators found dozens of personal papers and letters scattered around a wide area. An empty backpack lay nearby. The female victim had been beaten and stabbed once in the neck. Officers combed the area looking for clues to the victim's identity. But other than the letters, they found nothing. The unidentified woman was transported to the coroner's office for autopsy. Though the body had decayed beyond recognition, the medical examiner determined that the victim was a Caucasian woman, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, and likely between the ages of 35 and 45. She had been dead less than a week. Cause of death was a single stab wound to the neck, resulting in a laceration of the right carotid artery. Detectives at the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Department began the process of trying to identify the murder victim. Captain David Hall didn't have much information to work with.
First thing we did was basically get a measurement of the body and try to come up with an idea of what this individual looked like in a living state. We checked missing person files for the Mississippi and Louisiana area. Came up with nothing that fit the script of this young lady.
Investigators began sifting through the papers for clues. All of the correspondences were addressed to a woman named Liz, and they were all signed Michael Packer. His return address was located less than 100 miles away in Biloxi, Mississippi. Biloxi police were contacted and dispatched to the address where the letters had originated. Michael Packer was not there. According to his roommate, Packer had left several days earlier to work a job somewhere in Alabama. When questioned further, he stated that he knew a woman named Liz. Her full name was Elizabeth Herdman, and until recently, she and Michael Packer had been romantically involved. The roommate said that Liz and Michael fought constantly, mostly about money. In fact, a few weeks before, one of their arguments threatened to turn violent, prompting the roommate to call police. But rather than suffer in a violent relationship, Liz packed her belongings into a backpack and left. The roommate believed Liz was currently homeless, but he had seen her less than a week ago looking for work at a local employment agency. Hoping to confirm the victim's identity, Louisiana police ran a records check on Elizabeth Herdman. Investigators learned that the 39-year-old woman had been arrested on minor charges several years earlier in Florida, and her fingerprints were on file. When those were compared to the prints lifted from the victim, police found a perfect match. Police had identified the woman found murdered along the shores of the Pearl River. And her ex-boyfriend, who left town around the time of her murder, was the prime suspect. Now, investigators needed to find him. Police in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, had identified a woman found murdered near a riverbank as 39-year-old Elizabeth Herdman. To find her killer, investigators began retracing her movements in the days leading up to the murder. Louisiana police traveled to the employment agency in nearby Biloxi, Mississippi, where the homeless woman was last seen alive. The manager there confirmed that Liz Herdman had been in looking for work on May 18th, 3 days before her body was discovered. And Liz had not come in alone that day. According to the records, she had signed in with 2 men, Arthur Cyber and Alfred Huntsman, and a woman named Felice Fisher. The manager had seen the group together before and knew them to be friends. The manager also confirmed that Michael Packer, Liz Herdman's ex-boyfriend and the prime suspect in her murder, had signed in earlier that same day. But by the time Liz and her friends arrived, he had already left for a job in Mobile, Alabama.
10 minutes and I'll be coming your way.
Investigators were able to confirm that Packer was several hundred miles away when the murder occurred. Since Liz Herdman had been homeless at the time of her death, identifying a suspect would not be easy.
She's living on the street. Anyone could be the suspect. She comes across people capable of committing homicide on a daily basis.
Captain Hall began tracking down Liz's 3 friends, hopeful they could provide information. But a background check revealed that 2 of those friends, Alfred Huntsman and Arthur Cyber, had extensive criminal records, which included robbery and assault charges. Detectives traveled to a nearby motel where Arthur Cyber had recently been staying. Though he was no longer there, a motel employee remembered Cyber well. He had been staying in a room with 2 women and another man. One of the women matched Liz Herdman's description. The employee remembered that after the group checked out, she cleaned their room. It looked like there had been a violent struggle. The window had been broken, and there were stains on the bedspread that appeared to be blood. The motel employee hadn't seen anyone from that group around since, and they hadn't left a forwarding address. The information led investigators to now believe that Liz Herdman's friends were involved in her murder. An APB was immediately issued for the 3 individuals and the car they were believed to be driving.
We wanted to alert the nation that we were looking for Arthur Cyber and Alfred Huntsman and Felice Fisher for questioning reference to this homicide.
A few days later, police several hundred miles away in Hutchins, Texas, spotted the 3 suspects. They were taken into custody and transported to Louisiana for questioning. Police searched their vehicle and collected its contents, including 6 pairs of shoes, some papers, and a few articles of clothing. Under questioning, Alfred Huntsman admitted that he had information about the murder. Huntsman said that while the 4 friends were staying at the motel, Liz Herdman and Arthur Cyber had gotten into an argument. Liz had recently gotten a job, and Cyber wanted some of her money to buy drugs and alcohol. When she refused, Cyber smashed out the window and became physically abusive. Eventually, things calmed down, and a short while later, Cyber suggested that they all go into town. But according to Huntsman, Cyber drove the group to an isolated spot at the Pearl River. He said he wanted to go for a walk with Liz to privately apologize for his behavior at the motel. Several minutes later, Arthur Cyber emerged from the woods alone and covered with blood. He had murdered Liz, and the motive was robbery. Cyber threatened to kill him and Felice Fisher if they went to authorities. Huntsman insisted he and Felice never left the vehicle. When confronted with the statement, Arthur Cyber denied the accusation. Though he had been present at the river when the murder occurred, he said that it was Alfred Huntsman and Felice Fisher who carried out the homicide.
Right off the bat, one started giving up the other, pointing the finger. That at least lets us know that we've got the 3 parties responsible. And from there, you just start to meticulously break down the lies that they're giving you and ultimately end up with the truth.
For answers, investigators forwarded all of the evidence to forensic examiners at the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab. It was now up to them to find a way to prove which of the suspects had viciously killed Elizabeth Herdman.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Police in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, had 3 suspects in custody for the murder of 39-year-old Elizabeth Herdman. But with the suspects pointing the finger at each other, investigators needed to find a way to expose the killer's identity. They turned to examiners at the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab. There, forensic scientist George Shiro began scrutinizing the evidence collected from the crime scene. He focused his attention on a yellow piece of paper stained with the victim's blood. As he examined it more closely, he noticed a shoe print. On its own, he realized that the print would not be enough to establish the killer's identity. Though all 3 suspects admitted being at the Pearl River, each denied being near the victim when the murder occurred. To determine who was lying, Shiro first needed to know where the evidence was found in relation to the victim's body. For that, he turned to the crime scene photographs. In the photos, he observed several yellow pieces of paper. But after digitizing and enlarging the photographs, he saw that only one was stained with blood, and it was located just inches away from the victim's head. Now, Shiro looked to determine which of the suspects had left the print. He began by comparing the shoes recovered from the suspect's vehicle to the shoe print found within inches of Liz Herdman's body. He quickly eliminated 5 of the 6 pairs. But the tread on the remaining pair appeared to be similar to the print from the crime scene.
So I examined that shoe more carefully, and what we look for when we're examining shoe prints is we look for random markings on the soles of the shoe that give these shoes their individuality.
Shiro generated an impression of the shoe print found in the suspect's car onto a sheet of clear acetate paper. When that was overlaid on top of the bloody print recovered from the crime scene, he found one consistency after another.
That is an aha moment. That's when we say, okay, we have a match here. We have enough marks to individualize this shoe print to this shoe.
Police determined that the shoe that had left the print belonged to Alfred Huntsman. And Shiro's findings proved that he was within inches of the victim as her blood was shed, something he had previously denied. Confronted with the evidence, Huntsman confessed to taking part in the crime. But he insisted he hadn't worked alone. He said that he, Arthur Cyber, and Felice Fisher had driven Elizabeth Herdman to the clearing off of the remote road near the river with the intent to rob her. But the robbery spiraled out of control, and when Liz fought back, Arthur Cyber stabbed her in the neck. Huntsman admitted that he beat the victim while Cyber killed her. Polygraph tests later confirmed that all 3 suspects had participated in Elizabeth Herdman's murder. Arthur Cyber was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Alfred Huntsman received the same sentence. Felice Fisher pled guilty to accessory after the fact for first-degree murder and for second-degree kidnapping. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Most killers look to strike when their targets are isolated or far away from potential witnesses. When investigators struggle to identify a suspect, they turn to forensic examiners who can expose a killer's guilt caught in the camera's eye.